Chapter 2. We Invent the Franklin Stove. I slept late the next morning. When I woke, my fur cap home was hanging on the bedpost, and I in it. Dr. Franklin was again crouched over the fire, attempting to write, between fits of sneezing and hunting for his glasses. The fire, what there was of it, was smoking, and the room was as cold as ever. "Not wishing to be critical," I said, "but perhaps a bit of wood on that smoky ember that you seem to consider a fire might—" "Waste not, want not," said he, quite severely, and went on writing. "Well, just suppose," I said, "just suppose you spend 2 or 3 weeks in bed with pneumonia. Wouldn't that be a waste, or—" "It would be," said he, putting on a log, "whatever your name might be." "Amos," said I, "and then there'd be doctor's bills." "Bills," said he, shuddering, and put on 2 more logs quick. The fire blazed up then, and the room became a little better, but not much. "Dr. Franklin," I said, "that fireplace is all wrong." "You might just call me Ben, just plain Ben," said he. "What's wrong with my fireplace?" "Well, for one thing, most of the heat goes up the chimney, and for another, you can't get around it. Now, outside our church, there used to be a hot chestnut man. Sometimes when business was rushing, he'd drop a chestnut. My pop was always on the lookout, and almost before it touched the ground, he'd have it in his sack and down to the vestry. There he'd put it in the middle of the floor, and we'd all gather round for warmth. 28 of us it would heat, and the room as well. It was all because it was out in the open, not stuck in a hole in the wall like that fireplace." "Amos," he interrupts, excited, "there's an idea. But we couldn't move the fire out into the middle of the room." "We could if there were something to put it in, iron or something." "But the smoke," he objected. "Pipe," said I, and curled up for another nap. I didn't get my nap, though. Ben rushed off downstairs, came back with a great armful of junk, dumped it on the floor, and was off again for more. No one could have slept, not even a dormouse. After a few trips, he had a big pile of things there. There were scraps of iron, tin, and wire. There were a couple of old warming pans, an iron oven, 3 flat irons, 6 pot lids, a wire bird cage, and an anvil. There were saws, hammers, pincers, files, drills, nails, screws, bolts, bricks, sand, and an old broken sword. He drew out a sort of plan and went to work. With the clatter he made, there was no chance of a nap, so I helped all I could, picking up the nuts and screws and tools that he dropped, and his glasses. Ben was a fair terror for work, once he was interested. It was almost noon before he stopped for a bit of a rest. We looked over what had been done, and it didn't look so bad, considering. It was shaped much like a small fireplace set up on legs, with 2 iron doors on the front and a smoke pipe running from the back to the fireplace. He had taken the andirons out of the fireplace and boarded that up so we wouldn't lose any heat up the chimney. Ben walked around looking at it, proud as can be, but worried. "The floor," he says. "It's the floor that troubles me, Amos. With those short legs and that thin iron bottom, the heat." "Down on the docks," said I, "we used to hear the ship-rats telling how the sailors build their cooking fires on board ship. A layer of sand right on the deck, bricks on top of that, and—" "Amos," he shouts, "you've got it!" And he rushed for the bricks and sand. He put a layer of sand on the bottom of the affair, bricks on top of that, and then set the andirons in. It looked pretty promising. "Eureka!" he exclaimed, stepping back to admire it and tripping over the saw. "Straighten things up a bit, Amos, while I run and get some legs." "Don't try to run," I said. "And by the way, do you come through the pantry on your way up?" "Why?" he asked. "In some ways, Ben," I said, "you're fairly bright, but in others you're just plain dull. The joy of creating may be meat and drink to you, but as for me, a bit of cheese—" He was gone before I finished, but when he came back with the logs, he did have a fine slab of cheese and a loaf of rye bread. We put in some kindling and logs and lit her up. She drew fine, and Ben was so proud and excited that I had to be rather sharp with him before he would settle down to food. Even then, he was up every minute to admire it from a new angle. Before we finished even one sandwich, the room had warmed up like a summer afternoon. "Amos," says he, "we've done it." "Thanks for the we," I said. "I'll remember it." Chapter 3. The Bargain. When I woke up, the room was sizzling warm. Ben was happily writing, as usual, and I went over to see what was going on. So far he had written with a lot of flourishes. An account of the new Pennsylvania fireplace, recently invented by Dr. Benjamin Franklin, wherein their construction and their... "Ben," said I, "we'll have to come to an understanding. Do you recollect your exact words when it worked?" "Why, yes, I do," he admitted, very prompt. He was always fair, Ben was, just over-enthusiastic about himself. As I remember, those words were, "Amos, we've done it." "Exactly," says I. "We've done it. We means two, you and me. Now let's get things straight, Ben. Fame and honors are nothing to me. Cheese is. Also, there's my family to consider. 25 brothers and sisters in a cold vestry, and they're hungry. I can be a great help to you. I have proved that. Now, what do you propose?" He looked pretty thoughtful then, and I could feel a quotation coming on. Finally, it did. "The laborer is worthy of his hire," he said. "I don't labor," I said. "I think. And maxims don't fill empty stomachs. But that's not a bad one in itself. Be specific." Well, we talked it over for some time, and Ben was very reasonable about the whole affair. Generous, too. I think that being comfortably warm for once helped. We finally made the following agreement. Twice a week, rain or shine, he promised to have delivered to the vestry 1 2-ounce piece best quality cheese, 1 1-inch slice rye bread, fresh, 88 grains on-hulled wheat. For myself, I was to have as home or domicile to me and my heirs, to have and to hold forever without let or hindrance, with daily subsistence and clothing in addition thereto, 1 fur cap. On my part, I was to faithfully give and perform to him, Benjamin Franklin, advice, aid, assistance, at all times and under all conditions, and with him constantly to abide, till death did us part, so help me. Ben wrote it all up with lots of flourishes, Latin phrases, and seals. Then we both signed it and shook hands on the bargain. He was fine about the whole thing, and never used a single maxim. I must say he lived up to it, too. Not once in all the rest of his life did that bread, cheese, and wheat fail to reach the vestry twice a week, regular as clockwork. After that, we sat around for a while, basking in the warmth, and I couldn't help thinking how my fortunes had changed in a short 24 hours. Here I was in a snug, comfortable home, my family well provided for, with a good friend and an interesting future. I felt so much at peace with the world that when Ben finally asked, "Amos, what should we call this affair?" I said, "My friend, the credit is all yours. We shall call it the Franklin stove." Then we went to bed. I was soon comfortably settled in my new home. Ben, who was fairly well skilled with the needle, began to contrive many ingenious little improvements in the fur cap. There was a small compartment where I could keep a supply of food against an emergency, and of course a place for sleeping. There was also a peephole at the front through which I could see where we were going. This was of great value, for the streets of Philadelphia were, at that time, most ill-paved and congested. Ben never had his wits about him, and I was often able to prevent him from plunging into a mud puddle or a market cart. However, the most important improvement that we devised was a small hole in the lining of the cap just above his left ear. Through this I was able to give him, unnoticed by others, my observations and advice. Historians have been puzzled at the way Dr. Franklin seemed to know what was going on in the minds of others. He didn't. The things that I discovered and told him made it seem as though he did. The only remarkable thing about the whole business was me. Ben soon became so dependent on my device that he seldom ventured abroad without me. The fur cap, which formerly he had only used in inclement weather, he now wore constantly, indoors and out, doffing it only in the privacy of our own room. This, of course, attracted no little amount of attention, but Ben always enjoyed that. Chapter 4. Swimming. Our life together went along smoothly, and would have continued to do so had Ben not insisted on indulging in what I consider a dangerous, unsanitary, and barbarous custom. I refer to swimming. As the hot summer weather came on, we often took long walks in the country, which were, to me, most enjoyable. One unusually warm day, when we had come to a secluded spot on the banks of the Schuylkill, Ben suddenly stripped off all his clothing, donned a rather silly-looking striped garment which he called bathing trunks, and plunged into the water. It was only my sudden scream and sharp nip on the ear that prevented him from diving in, cap and all. While he sported in a most ridiculous fashion, snorting and floundering about, I, in the cap, was left perched on his heap of clothing, prey to any wandering cat, dog, hawk, or snake that chanced to come along. As we walked home that evening, I spoke my mind fully on this ridiculous habit and the dangers to which it exposed me. "In addition," I said, "your hair is soaking wet, and I shall no doubt contract a frightful cold." Ben was stubborn about it, though. He was rather proud of his skill as a swimmer and insisted that nothing would happen to me. Nothing did for some time, until one afternoon, as I watched Ben diving, snorting, and splashing like an overgrown grampus, the thing I dreaded came to pass. Along the bank came trotting a half-grown mongrel dog, seeking mischief, as is the usual habit of such brutes. I looked wildly for Ben, but at the moment only the soles of his feet were visible. Fortunately, there were many bushes and small trees about, so I lost no time in scurrying up a small sapling. Here, in a broad crotch, I settled in comfort to watch the proceedings. The mongrel, spying Ben, rushed to the bank, barking furiously. Ben shoo-shooed and shouted as he floundered frantically toward shore. The pile of clothing next attracted the dog's attention. Nosing it over, he selected the cap and trotted off with it just as Ben, dripping and panting, slithered up the muddy bank. With a wild cry of "Amos! Amos!" Ben charged after him. Apparently, this was just the sort of frolic that the dog had been seeking, so for a full quarter-hour he had a jolly romp with poor Ben. Ben coaxed, pleaded, threatened, but all to no avail. Had I not been in such a bad temper, his ridiculous antics would have been most amusing. At length, finally tiring of the game, the mongrel picked up the cap and trotted off up the river bank, hotly pursued by Ben, who dashed through thickets and over rocks with utter disregard of his ill-clad person. Scarce had they disappeared around a curve in the river bank when 2 country yokels appeared upon the scene. Noting the pile of clothing and failing to discover its owner, they became greatly excited. Their excitement increased on discovering Ben's silver watch engraved with his name. "The great Dr. Franklin!" they shouted. "He drownded! Drownded!" And they took to their heels in the direction of Philadelphia, carrying Ben's clothes with them. It was warm and sunny in my tree, and very quiet now. Far up the river I could still hear occasional sounds of barking. These finally culminated in a terrific outburst of yelps and howls. Then all was silent, and I fell asleep. I was wakened by the footfalls of an approaching figure, which I took to be Ben, but few could have recognized in that ludicrous and bedraggled apparition the famous Dr. Franklin. His legs were muddied, bruised, and scratched, his bathing trunks torn, his glasses missing. His wet hair, which hung in long disordered wisps, was surmounted by the fur cap, worn at a drunkenly rakish angle. As he approached, limping, he kept up a continual sound of fingers snapping, whistling, and clucking. "Amos! Amos!" he called. "Amos, where are you?" all the while peering nearsightedly into the bushes along the way. Touched as I was by his fondness for me, I could not help a chuckle at his appearance. I was about to relieve his anxiety when my attention was caught by the approach of a great crowd of people from the direction of Philadelphia. Among them I could discern the governor, the mayor, and many other prominent citizens, as well as Ben's first volunteer fire brigade. Ben looked frantically about, but there was no escape save in the water, and he had had enough of that. So folding his arms, he attempted to appear as dignified as possible and awaited their arrival. As he did so, he leaned against the tree in which I had taken refuge. Without a moment's loss, I slipped into the cap so gently as to be entirely unnoticed. As the crowd beheld Ben, everyone broke into shouts of relief and joy, accompanied, however, by not a few snickers. He was surrounded by a throng all wanting to shake his hand and congratulate him. Various articles of clothing were loaned, and he was soon decently garbed. Through it all, however, Ben preserved an appearance of the utmost despondency. The governor approached, offering his hat, a very elegant affair trimmed with lace and gold braid. "Permit me, Dr. Franklin," he said, most courteous. "Pray do me the honor to wear this. Your present headgear appears, slightly disheveled." "Never!" cried Ben angrily. "This cap shall never again leave my head." And he reached up both hands to settle it more firmly. I bit his thumb. "Amos!" he exclaimed happily. "I beg your pardon?" said the governor. "Yes, Amos," I whispered fiercely, "and if you don't get us home quickly, you'll be hearing from me. Your hair is soaking wet, and this cap stinks so strong of dog that I'm half suffocated." Ben brightened up at once, and by the time the procession reached home was as pleased with himself as though he had done something really smart. instead of just scaring the town half to death.